The slaughter was suspended only by the darkness of night. Just imagine reading those chilling words in a report. That's exactly what Major General Andrew Jackson wrote to Tennessee Governor Willie Blount right after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814. It's an incredibly visceral sentence, and honestly, it perfectly captures the unrelenting, aggressive nature of a man who would go on to fundamentally reshape the American Republic. We're looking at a historical figure who didn't just participate in events, He absolutely attacked them.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the public life of Andrew Jackson, but we're going to look at it through a very specific thematic lens. We are exploring his entire career as a series of distinct but totally interconnected battlefields. Whether he was facing down rival empires in the humid swamps of Louisiana, battling entrenched economic interests in the capital, or even testing the constitutional limits of his own office, Jackson approached literally every obstacle with the exact same militaristic doctrine. We're going to deconstruct how his so-called iron will achieved unprecedented victories, and we'll also look at the devastating human and constitutional costs it left in its wake.
Okay, let's jump right into our roadmap for today. We'll be covering 1. Forging the iron will. 2. The economic battlefield. 3. A crisis of constitution. And 4. The Trail of Tears.
Part 1. Forging the iron will. Military brilliance and brutality.
So, to really understand Jackson the president, we first have to understand Jackson the general. This was a man whose entire tactical mindset was defined by sheer speed, overwhelming force, and just a complete disregard for traditional boundaries. During the Gulf Campaign, his military ascension was incredibly rapid. In March of 1814 at Horseshoe Bend, his coalition trapped and killed over 800 Creek warriors, which effectively broke Creek military power for good. But Jackson didn't just stop and wait for orders. Believing that the Spanish territory of Florida was being used as a staging ground by his enemies, he actually willfully disobeyed direct orders from Washington to stay out. By November, he just went ahead and seized Pensacola anyway to deny it to the British. And then by December, he was rapidly consolidating his forces for a decisive showdown in New Orleans. His distance from Washington essentially allowed his iron will to operate completely unchecked at the operational level.
Now, what made Jackson so incredibly lethal in this theater was his extreme pragmatism. And this is beautifully illustrated by the wild, diverse coalition he built for the Battle of New Orleans. He wasn't just relying on regular U.S. troops or the local militias. He allied with freemen of color and Choctaw Indians. He even enlisted the notorious smugglers Jean Lafitte and his Baratarians. Why? Well, because Lafitte's men knew the intricate bayous like the back of their hands. They utilized deep water to launch into the Caribbean and shallow water to escape heavy Spanish warships. Jackson couldn't care less about their criminal status. He only cared that their unique maritime skills gave him a massive tactical advantage against the British.
You must not sleep until you reach me. Talk about an uncompromising boss, right? This dispatch perfectly captures his demanding leadership style. As he was prepping for the incoming British assault, he sent this to Major General John Coffee, who was a veteran of his Creek campaign, ordering a brutal forced march all the way from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. There was zero room for negotiation here. This is the mindset of a man who demands total commitment and absolute victory.
Moving to Part 2, the economic battlefield, the 1832 Bank War.
So Jackson makes it to the White House, but he certainly doesn't leave his militaristic doctrine behind. He just changes his target, aiming squarely at the second bank of the United States. Modern international relations theory actually gives us a really brilliant framework for understanding this whole conflict. We can basically view Jackson's 1832 veto of the bank's recharter as a preventive war. Jackson and the bank's president, Nicholas Biddle, probably could have reached a compromise, but Jackson came to view this federally chartered interstate bank as more than just bad policy. He saw it as a rival hegemonic power. To him, it was an unconstitutional entity that was going to inevitably corrupt the republic. So, facing what he perceived as a massive threat, Jackson initiated a total war to destroy the institution before it could destroy the nation.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the massive geographic disparity that Jackson used to validate his populist arguments against this sort of crony capitalism. Look at the breakdown. Over $13.5 million in bank stock were held in the middle and eastern states in 1832, and another $8.4 million were held by foreign investors who were mostly British. Meanwhile, the western states held a paltry $140,000. Jackson argued that this wasn't really a national bank at all. He saw it as an apparatus designed purely to extract wealth from the frontier, just to enrich Eastern elites and foreign subjects.
Jackson's veto message grounded all these vast numbers into a stark, everyday reality for the voters. Take the branch bank in Mobile, Alabama, for example. In 1831, it made over $95,000 in profit. Yet, because practically none of the stock was held by local citizens, the state of Alabama couldn't tax it. They couldn't raise a single cent of revenue from those operations. The interest being paid by Western farmers was quite literally being drained away to pay dividends in Europe and the Northeast. To Jackson, this was just an unbearable burden on the common man's industry. And destroying the bank was a matter of national survival. And through these ruthless economic policies, Jackson ultimately pulled off a completely unique historical feat. He successfully paid off the entire national debt, though, as we know, it definitely set the stage for some intense economic consequences shortly after.
Part 3. A Crisis of Constitution, the Supreme Court Showdown.
This brings us to his third battlefield, the Constitution itself. When Jackson's iron will collided head-on with the separation of powers, the Republic faced a very severe crisis. The origins of the showdown lie in the state of Georgia's aggressive attempts to strip the Cherokee Nation of their land. This whole situation culminated in the landmark 1832 Supreme Court case, Worcester versus Georgia. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled incredibly clearly here. The Cherokee Republic was a sovereign nation. Therefore, the state of Georgia had absolutely no jurisdiction over them, and the federal treaties protecting Cherokee lands had to be honored.
And this brilliantly illustrates a terrifying exertion of executive will. On one side, you have the highest court in the land affirming national supremacy and native sovereignty. But on the other side, you have President Jackson, who simply refused to enforce the decision. He wanted to end the federal practice of recognizing tribes as sovereign nations, so he basically just stood back and allowed Georgia to illegally encroach on Cherokee territory.
So how on earth did Jackson justify ignoring the Supreme Court? Well, he did it by radically redefining the whole concept of executive will. Jackson firmly believed that above everyone else, he alone represented the true will of the people. In his mind, federal judges were merely appointed officials, and congressmen only represented their own individual states. But the president was voted into office by the entire nation. By doing this, he signaled a highly dangerous precedent, essentially saying that states did not have to follow unpopular federal law as long as their actions aligned with the beliefs of the executive branch. It was a complete and total breakdown of the checks and balances designed by the founders.
Part 4. The Trail of Tears, the Human Cost of Executive Power.
Now, the breakdown of those constitutional safeguards didn't just result in some theoretical debate in Washington. It had tragic, deadly, and immediate consequences on the ground. Because the Supreme Court's ruling was ignored, the Indian Removal Act was ruthlessly enforced. United States soldiers gathered between 16,000 and 20,000 Cherokee at gunpoint. These people were violently forced to abandon their homes, their established diplomatic arrangements, a highly integrated economy, and their ancestral lands in the Southeast.
What followed was a deadly military expulsion. The Cherokee were forced to march by foot all the way to designated territories west of the Mississippi River. In the Cherokee language, this horrific journey is remembered as Nunadal Tsuni, which roughly translates to the trail where they cried.
So the crucial point we have to take away from this is the staggering human toll of the policy. During that forced relocation, at least 4,000 Cherokees died from exposure, disease, and starvation. And some historical accounts suggest the true number might actually be twice that. The Cherokee psyche and society were dealt a horrific blow from which they would never fully recover. It was a calamity of unparalleled proportions, engineered directly by executive will.
It's also really important to note that this was deeply controversial, even at the time. Prominent figures absolutely recognized the danger and the immorality of the government's actions. Davy Crockett, the famous frontiersman and congressman, was so incredibly outraged by the hypocrisy of the Indian Removal Act that he actually resigned from Congress in protest. He stated that he would sooner be honestly and politically damned than hypocritically immortalized.
From the muddy trenches of New Orleans to the polished halls of the Bank of the United States, Andrew Jackson proved time and again that an iron will could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. But when that exact same militaristic force was turned inward, wielded against the Supreme Court and vulnerable populations, it severely fractured the very foundations of the Republic. Which leaves us with a pretty critical question to think about. If a democratic system's separation of powers can be completely dismantled by the unchecked force of one executive's will, just how secure are the checks and balances that we rely on today? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and we will see you next time.